Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a literal economic thriller. We're looking at the year 1991 and how India went from the absolute brink of financial ruin to becoming a global powerhouse. Let's get right into it. So, to really grasp the gravity of the situation, we need to start with this terrifying number, 3. In 1991, India had enough foreign exchange left for exactly 3 weeks of imports. Just 3. Imagine a massive nation of nearly 1 billion people, literally days away from not being able to buy oil or basic essential supplies. Behind closed doors, the cabinet secretary actually warned the incoming prime minister that things were far worse than the newspapers were letting on. They were staring straight down the barrel of total, complete national bankruptcy. How did it get that bad? Well, it was a perfect storm, a crazy cascade of external shocks and internal chaos perfectly aligned to push the nation over the edge. First, in 1985, the USSR collapses. The Soviet Union was India's biggest trading partner, so losing them instantly shattered a massive economic pipeline. Fast forward to 1990, the Gulf War breaks out. Since India relied heavily on the Gulf for petroleum, oil prices absolutely skyrocketed, making imports cripplingly expensive. And then, right when the country desperately needed a steady hand, 1991 hits. The domestic government collapses, minority governments completely fail to pass budgets, and amidst a heated election, tragedy strikes with a massive assassination. It was so chaotic that the IMF actually stalled bailout talks because, well, they literally didn't know who was in charge. By late 1990, the math was just brutally unforgiving. India's foreign exchange reserves plummeted to a measly 2,500 crore rupees. Because of all that political instability and the failure to pass a budget, foreign rating agencies severely downgraded India's credit rating. And you know what that means? Getting new loans to cover those massive import bills became basically impossible. The country was, for all intents and purposes, entirely out of cash. Section 1. The root cause, the License Raj era. So, driven by a deep historical fear of foreign rule, mostly stemming from the whole East India Company experience, post-independence India was incredibly cautious. They built up this suffocating system of extreme protectionism known as the License Raj. This was an era completely defined by strict government quotas, endless bureaucracy, and mandatory licenses required to open or expand pretty much any private business. It was insanely difficult to get anything off the ground. You needed a ton of capital, and the sheer amount of red tape and corruption made industrial growth crawl at a snail's pace. The contrast here is super stark. On one hand, you had the pre-1991 private sector, heavily restricted, totally starved of support, struggling just to get basic licenses, and actually forced by law to stay artificially small. On the other hand, the pre-1991 public sector completely monopolized major industries. We're talking infrastructure, mining, steel, telecom, the whole shebang. But because they faced zero private competition, these massive government-controlled entities were incredibly inefficient and just bleeding money. The business environment was so incredibly hostile to outside investment that massive global players actually just threw their hands up and left. In the late 1970s, giants like Coca-Cola and IBM completely packed up and exited the Indian market. The government's whole philosophy back then was basically to prevent any private company, especially foreign ones, from getting too big. But by doing that, they effectively choked off all economic momentum. Section 2. The Emergency Triage. So, a new coalition government steps into this fiery crisis under Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao, and they tap former RBI Governor Manmohan Singh as finance minister. He had about a month to save the country. His first drastic move? A massively controversial 20% devaluation of the Indian rupee against the US dollar. Now, usually, even a tiny fractional drop in currency value causes absolute panic. So dropping it by 20% in one fell swoop, people thought the government had literally lost its mind. But it was an aggressive, totally necessary shock to the system to alter import and export values, making Indian exports instantly more competitive globally and stopping the massive outflow of cash. But arguably the most dramatic emergency measure, and this sounds like something straight out of a movie, was the secret airlifting of 47 tons of gold. The government literally loaded up the nation's gold reserves onto planes and flew them to foreign banks to pledge as collateral. I mean, they were that desperate. They needed to secure enough hard cash loans just to keep the lights on for the next few weeks. Section 3. Rewriting the Rules. The 1991 Industrial Policy. Once the immediate bleeding stopped, the government unleashed a massive system reboot. These specific policy changes basically dismantled decades of tight government control overnight. First, they allowed up to 51% foreign direct investment, finally welcoming the outside capital they had feared for so long. They scrapped the highly restrictive MRTP Act entirely. They abolished that suffocating license raj for about 80% of companies, and they ended the phased manufacturing program taxes, which had been hitting foreign goods with massive tariffs, a total 180. Let's actually zoom in on that MRTP Act for a second, because it's a huge deal. The Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act was essentially a rule that told private companies, hey, you cannot grow past a certain size. It specifically targeted and held back businesses with over 1,000 crore rupees in investments. By throwing this act in the trash, the government finally gave Indian businesses the absolute freedom to scale up, modernize, and actually make their own independent investment decisions without having to constantly beg bureaucrats for permission. To open the market even further, public sector monopolies were drastically slashed. Decades of strict government dominance were rolled back, leaving only 3 highly sensitive areas exclusively in government hands: railways, mining, and atomic energy. Literally everything else was de-reserved and opened up to private sector competition. They even stripped away the constant need for government approvals for the remaining public sector companies. They basically said, okay, you have the autonomy to run like real competitive businesses now. All these individual moves built into a really cohesive 3-step strategy for rapid modernization. Step 1, remove import restrictions. They ditched the old restrictive lists and just made a specific negative list of what you couldn't import, opening the floodgates for everything else. Step 2, support small-scale industries. By incentivizing large companies to invest in smaller ones, they upgraded local tech while creating jobs. And Step 3, attract massive foreign investment. With relaxed rules, foreign money and technological advancements could finally flow in unchecked. Section 4, a transformed nation. We've talked a lot about macroeconomic policy, but how did this actually change daily life? The visual transformation was honestly unbelievable. Before 1991, Indian consumers had super limited choices. You saw ambassador cars on the road, watched state-run Doordarshan on TV, and used local electronics. But after 1991, boom! A highly restricted local market was suddenly flooded with top-tier global consumer goods. All of a sudden, you're seeing Toyota and Hyundai cars, Sony TVs, Star Plus Entertainment, and you could actually go grab a Coca-Cola or a McDonald's burger. It was an absolute explosion of choice, quality, and entirely new sectors of employment. Because those massive, saturated Western markets finally had access to India's vast, mostly untapped consumer base, foreign exchange just poured in. And here's the best part. Succeeding governments actually stuck with this policy of globalization. That legendary policy shift compounded year after year, eventually propelling the nation to become the 5th largest economy in the world today. I mean, think about that. From literally having to mortgage their national gold just to survive a 3-week window, to standing as a dominant global economic pillar. Incredible. I want to leave you with this powerful thought from Manmohan Singh's historic 1991 budget speech. No power can stop an idea whose time has come. It was India's time to change, and the timing aligned perfectly. So looking at how rapidly one aggressive policy pivot altered the fate of 1 billion people, it makes you wonder, right? How might today's seemingly radical economic policies be quietly shaping the global superpowers of tomorrow? Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.